This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Tuesday, May 19th, 2026. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio doing a sort of emergency podcast because I'm out of my mind about just the more I dig into this gender identity stuff in relation to the case that I'm bringing on behalf of the female inmates at the Maine Correctional Center. The more I am just going insane. Actually, I'll just share with you two things that happened recently that just put a fine point on how important this conversation is. Okay, this conversation about gender identity and what it means in the upcoming election and whether or not we're going to insert gender identity protection as a class in our Constitution. I got a call this morning from one of my clients who's a female inmate at the Maine Correctional Center, and um, she's a special client. I've had a lot of clients. I've had like hundreds of clients, and there's just some clients you take a special liking to, still maintaining a professional boundary, of course. But this particular client is in the Maine Correctional Center for possessing drugs because, like a lot of young people who were raised by drug addicts, they were exposed to drugs and became, unfortunately, addicted themselves. And this particular person was doing quite well in recovery, but had a relapse and, unfortunately, uh, has a short sentence at the Maine Correctional Center. Meanwhile, she has children, three beautiful children, as she describes them, young, ages like I think between 5 and 10. And the children are living with their father while this client is in the Maine Correctional Center. And the children have never been away from their mother for very long. And so this has been very, very difficult. And in order for my client to have contact with her children, she has to take a parenting class, according to the Maine Correctional Center. But the parenting class isn't available to her because she's in segregation. And the reason she's in segregation is because she refused to or protested, complained about, reported sexual assault by a male inmate at the Maine Correctional Center, right? A so-called like trans inmate, I guess, who identifies as something other than a man, even though he is a man. So my client is denied access to her children because we have in Maine a gender identity law that was passed in 2019, added to the Maine Human Rights Act that I'm going to get to in just a minute. We have a gender identity law that enables any man at any time to declare themselves to have a gender identity as female and have legal access to female spaces, including the women's center at the Maine Correctional Center. So we have a man who is convicted of murdering his parents and killing his dog, housed at the women's center. And as a result, the women there, if they want to be away from him, if they don't want to bunk with or shower with or share a bathroom with this guy who's threatening them and assaulting them and is in for life, essentially for murder, well, then they have to be in segregation. And if they're in segregation, they're denied classes on top of being denied every other privilege that this guy gets at the women's center. They can't go to church. They can't go to the store. They can't leave their room. There's no fresh air. They can't go outside. They can't take classes. They can't see their children because of this gender identity law. Okay, so now this is the other communication I had. This is the communication I had with the Maine Human Rights Commission. Okay, the Maine Human Rights Commission, whose executive director now is Kit, I don't know, Kit Carson, I want to say, but that's not his name. It's not their name. The executive director, Kit Thompson Crossman, who, along with the Maine Human Rights Commission legal counsel, have filed a lawsuit. Okay, this is a lawsuit that the Maine Human Rights Commission has filed against like 5 small rural school districts because these small rural school districts, school boards decided through a democratic process to categorize athletics on the basis of biological sex. Like, that's their right, right? Like local control. Well, the Maine Human Rights Commission has decided to take it upon themselves to sue these school districts, something that has not been done in really the history as far as the reporting goes, ever of the Maine Human Rights Commission, right? They've never done this before, but they decided to bring this lawsuit on behalf of hypothetical, non-existent plaintiffs. Like, there's no one they've identified who actually has been harmed by these school districts who have decided to separate athletics on the basis of biological sex. But the Human Rights Commission executive director and the lawyer decided to bring this lawsuit using, I mean, untold resources, right? I mean, this is like public dollars. These are people, the Human Rights Commission budget is something like $2.5 million. The council they get paid over $100,000, and they got a raise, I think, of like 12%, like in the last couple of years. I mean, and this is taxpayer money that we're, we're coughing up for people who are not elected, okay, who are supposed to be doing like the business of the Maine Human Rights Commission, not their own personal political agenda. And yet, these two people decided, apparently they'll say that it was the Human Rights Commission that decided, but I think it's pretty clear that who calls the shots at the Maine Human Rights Commission is the council and the executive director. So they filed this lawsuit using all our resources as a state to I guess prevent girls from having single sex sports. Okay, so I did a freedom of access request because, in conjunction with the litigation that I'm doing for these inmates in the prison, I'm interested in how we are where we are. So I did a freedom of access request for all the claims that were filed based on gender identity, because I'm trying to get at why is the Human Rights Commission so focused on gender identity when, when the reality of it is so unfair to women and kids. It's just like I can't understand it. Well, now that I've done this research, I can kind of understand a little bit more, and it goes something like this. In 2019, this guy Kit, right? Kit Crossman is hired to be an investigator. The Human Rights Commission lawyer is Barbara Hirsch. Kit Crossman as far as I know, is a man who identifies as a woman. Okay, he's a trans-identified man, and Barbara Hirsch has testified before the legislature, even though she was being paid as a lawyer for the Human Rights Commission. She testified in her personal capacity that she has a daughter who has come out as trans. And so Barbara Hirsch is like has skin in the game because she says, like, you know, that if these trans bills passed when her daughter was growing up, her daughter might have killed herself. It's just this emotional blackmail that's unbelievable. But the bottom line is that I requested public documents of all the complaints and that were made based on gender identity because it was raised as this big important issue, right? It's this marginalized community that's being discriminated against, and we have to look out for them. We have to make these special rules to protect them because there's these higher rates of suicide. Well, that's just all complete BS. There's not higher rates of suicide. Yes, there are increased rates of suicidal thoughts, but that's because a lot of these trans-identified kids have comorbidities, like Barbara Hirsch's daughter, who she testified had an eating disorder and like like OCD about exercise. And around the time Barbara Hirsch herself was going through a divorce and came out as a lesbian. And so, yeah, maybe her daughter was trans and suicidal, but maybe there were some other things going on that caused her to have suicidal thoughts. Bottom line is, there's no higher rates of suicide for youth who have ideas about gender identity. That's just a complete emotional blackmail marketing pitch by people who are accessing power, mainly GLAD Law, ACLU, the Maine Human Rights Commission. So, 2019, the the Human Rights Commission says to the Judiciary Committee, we need to clarify the Maine Human Rights Act by adding gender identity just after Kit Crossman, right, gets hired as the executive director. Maybe it's a coincidence, but there's no minutes of any meeting that the Human Rights Commission itself took any vote. There's a reference, a vague reference to the bill that was going to clarify the Human Rights Commission as just like, oh, the commission bill. Yeah, we're shuffling through the process. It's all going quite as planned. No discussion whatsoever about the dramatic impact that adding gender identity to the Maine Human Rights Commission has on the rights of women and girls. Not a scintilla of discussion about the fact that all of a sudden we have now in Maine law a situation where any man at any time can just invade women and girls' spaces, be on our teams. I have just recently an anecdote of a friend who gave the friend gave their daughter-in-law a gift certificate to go to one of these spas, like where you get your feet soaked and you whatever, sit in hot and so she goes into the women's section of the spa, and there's a guy in there, buck naked, with his, hairy, like, gross genitals swinging around, like, totally unpleasant, total bummer. Just not, like, at all what was meant, like, to be this experience, and the only reason why this guy has the right to be there is because gender identity laws, and we have boys who insist on playing on girls' teams, and it's because of gender identity law. So we made this massive change in the law, completely upending the rights of women and girls. We have no protections on the basis of sex. We can't exclude men from anything at any time. And, it's not any of the men that I'm associated with who are demanding access to women's spaces. Not, my father, my husband, my sons, my uncles, my brothers, my brother-in-laws, my friends, my clients, no men in my arena are the type of men who demand access to women's spaces. Okay. I'm not talking about most men. I'm talking about the kind of men that rig the system to prey on vulnerable women and girls. The same category of men that have been around forever and will always be around, because that is, unfortunately, the human condition. And it's so disturbing to me that the Maine Human Rights Commission has the energy, will use our resources, my tax dollars, to pay these people, these two people who have personal skin in the game, a so-called transgender person and a person who's a parent of a transgender person, like, just manipulating the law, presenting to the Judiciary Committee something that is described as a clarification of the Human Rights Act that has huge ramifications, not presenting it to the Human Rights Commission for a vote, having the legislature pass it, okay? And then having the gall to say in response to my freedom of access request that it's going to take them. Okay. I requested public documents of all the numbers of, because, Jesus, if we're going to do this big freaking change to the law, we should at least find out what was behind it. So I asked how many claims have been filed. Well, I'll just cut to the chase and say, I did the research. 0 claims have been filed. But you know what the Human Rights Commission said? You know what the executive director said in response to my FOA request? He said, with regard to the request for all public records relating to all charges based on gender identity from 2005 to the present, here is our conservative time and cost estimate. We anticipate at least 87 hours of staff time to identify files, recall them from archives, redact all confidential and identifying information, and make copies. The staff time alone would amount to $2,150, 85 chargeable hours at $25 an hour. And we would need to be paid in advance. And we also charge $10 a page copy. Okay. Like I said, I gave away, like, I don't know, I guess I gave away the whole point, which is that That is complete bullshit because there's 0 complaints. You can go to the minutes of the Human Rights Commission files annual reports, and I went through and I read today, okay, in less than it took me a while. It took me at least 5 hours, but in 5 hours, I was able to, quickly figure out that this was just, a total scheme to deprive me of this information because they're political players and they're not public servants. They are gaming the system to push an ideology, and they are not elected, and it offends me. And it should offend you. And this is why we need to change things in Augusta, because you can go through all the minutes of all the Human Rights Commission meetings, and it lists the cases that they've decided, and it identifies whether the commission found reasonable grounds or not reasonable grounds, and then it says on the basis of, and like I read through every single one, and not a single claim was referenced having anything to do with sexual orientation or gender identity. And then you can also go to the annual reports, which I read every single one from like going back to 2015 to the present, because and the annual reports identify the number of claims that were filed. They identify the types of claims that were filed, whether they were, housing discrimination or employment discrimination. And then they identify the category of discrimination, whether it's on the basis of disability or race or sex. And like, not surprisingly, those are the three that are like most of the complaints, like most legitimate complaints of discrimination are on the basis of sex, race, or disability, along with other like religion. I mean, so there's no history of ever being uh, there's no history of claims filed on the basis of disability. There's no I just got that wrong. I apologize. There's no history of any claims being filed on the basis of gender identity. That's the point. Disability is number 1, gender identity is 0, and it's all in the records. And so it's offensive to me that the executive director of the Human Rights Commission would send me a response to a freedom of access request saying they essentially don't have time or the resources to get to my request, when meanwhile they are pumping these resources into suing rural school districts. And for what? For what? There's not a single person they can point to who's been discriminated against on the basis of gender identity. This was just rammed through. It was it it's so easy to trace, and this Glad Law outfit has just handprints, fingerprints all over it. They are, the NRA of the Alphabet Club, and they are running things, calling the shots. I looked at all the testimony. They've this is the circular arguments that we're in. So even though there were 0 cases of gender identity discrimination that led to the massive change in the Human Rights Act to add gender identity to as a protected status, right? Okay, we added that as protected status, which completely erases protections on the basis of sex. So we added that with 0 people having brought claims. Then fast forward when we're trying to like claw back, when we're trying to get back to a sense of normality and pass bills that would separate sports on the basis of biological sex. Glad Law, the same outfit that advocated for, that pushed adding gender identity as a clarification, even though there was no cases, they come forward and say, well, you know, this, is trans athletes isn't a problem. Like, look, there's only a couple of cases. They haven't met their burden. They haven't even shown this is a real problem because there's only just this sprinkling of cases. It's like, well, there was no cases to completely upend the level playing field that had been the case under Title IX. So we completely altered the landscape for 0 live cases, just bending the knee to this ideology, right? Just for the executive director of the Maine Human Rights Commission and the co-counsel, they have an agenda. They think this is a good idea. They push it through. They don't even tell the commissioners, right? They don't have a vote. But then they write up a letter and they say that, oh, this is a clarification. The Judiciary Committee says, oh, well, if the Human Rights Commission says it's good, I guess we have to say it's good. So then they go back, right? This executive director and this counselor, Hirsch, then they can go back to the commission and say, well, the legislature passed the law. So, now gender identity is it. And you can just see they're just rigging the game to push their own personal political agenda with absolutely no accountability. And meanwhile, bringing this lawsuit on behalf of nobody, no real people, right? Hypothetical people. This lawsuit that they filed in Kennebunk County is just like, I mean, if it on information and belief, they think there might be somebody because there's at least one email they have from an adult who made a threat. How do they know it was an adult in an email? This is the lamest complaint I think I've read in a really long time. And it bothers me that this is where our tax dollars are going. That this is the work of the Human Rights Commission, despite legitimate claims of people who have disability discrimination claims, despite legitimate claims of people who have been sexually harassed, discriminated against on the basis of sex. Their cases, no. The Human Rights Commission decides to sue school districts over gender identity. And meanwhile, there are women, right? Okay. The change in the law has had no impact on anyone that they can identify, that they can point to who's a real person, except that my clients are real people. My clients are real people in the correction center, and they're being deprived contact with their children. Okay, they're being deprived like opportunities for like advancement while they're in jail. They have no privileges. They're segregated because they protested being housed with a man who has a gender identity as a female. It's the gender identity laws. It's an elitist, like progressive um, fantasy. It's solving nobody's problems except men who have like a desire to just have special rights. It's and like, you know what? It's no surprise to me that there's men who are trying to oppress women because, like, hey, you know what? It's been going on for a really long time. So, for the younger generation who thinks somehow it's progress that now we have white men in dresses trying to oppress us, like, no, this is the same old song. And we need to call a spade a spade. This is discrimination against women. It harms kids. Gender identity has no place in Maine law. It came out of nowhere in the grassroots. Okay. Not a single claim has been filed. You can't point to a single person who has brought forth like a legitimate claim of discrimination on the basis of gender identity. This was a coup by men who claim to be women who want special rights. These are people like who we see testify on behalf of Equality Maine, right? And this is the executive director of the Maine Human Rights Commission himself, herself, their self. This is a political, personal quest by people who are bureaucrats. And that's why elections matter. That's why we need to appoint people to the Maine Human Rights Commission who are going to, I think, get to the bottom of why we are spending public dollars bringing lawsuits for hypothetical plaintiffs when there are real women in jail being denied access to their children because of this gender identity law. It's maddening to me. So stay tuned. And until next time, this is Cynthia Dill signing off. Take care.